morning, it's Penny from Cabin in the Woods Quilters. I'm up in my studio today. You get to see a little bit more of fabric going on back here. So this is an add-on video, just a really quick video as best I can to my Scrap Petal Garden video that I provided on explaining a little bit of the selections. And one of the requests that I had was to in-depth explain the difference in the two methods that I use to put the quilt together. So as a reference, let me get the quilt out. This is the quilt. It's the big petal quilt. Right, there it is. Okay, this is the Scrap Petal Garden quilt. And when I teach the class, I do offer a choice in your kit of what type of product or what type of method you want to use to put it together. So let me explain the two methods and the pros and cons of both. And that way, sort of in my own words, it's a little easier to do a video than it is to do a sheet, but it sort of gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. So here are the two products that I use. So the first product I use is called Terial Magic. There's the bottle. This is a 16-ounce bottle of Terial Magic. This is how it comes packaged now. So one of these, if you choose this option, this is the size bottle you get in your kit. So Terial Magic, what is it? It is a stabilizer spray. And they're getting a little bit more popular on the market these days. There's another one, I think, by Odif called Fabric Booster. Works sort of the same way. So what this is a spray-in stabilizer that you put on your fabric. I use it just like a starch. I spray it like a starch. But it gets your fabric a whole lot more stiffer than, or a whole lot more stiff than any kind of starch could do. It's, in fact, will get your fabric, the more you put on, you press it, it dries, it stiffens the fabric. The more you put on, the stiffer it gets. It sort of adheres to the fibers of your fabric. It's washable, so once it goes through the wash, it all goes out, just like sizing. But it makes your fabric much more paper-like. So why would you use it? You would use it to stabilize a fabric, and for those of you who have a lot of experience working with different types of fabric, the more loosely woven it is, the harder it is to hold its shape. Some fabrics are just a little bit more stretchy. What we do with this fabric, with this stabilizer with your fabric in this particular case, is I use it to do applique. If I'm going to wash a fabric and I want all the stiffness to go out of the fabric, but I want to do a machine applique, what I will do is use this product to stiffen the background of my block, and then I will use it to stiffen all the fabrics that I use to do the applique. Now what that does is it allows the fabrics themselves, 2 layers of cotton, to go under your machine, and any type of decorative stitch or a zigzag stitch or a buttonhole stitch which crosses both fabrics, both the background and the applique, it actually does that on the back as well. And that all has to do with tension. So in order to get those stitches just right, you need a lot of tension. And if you've ever had experience with doing a zigzag stitch to hold something together, and you flip the fabric over and you see the bobbin stitching on the back sort of pulls the fabric together, and what you get sort of is like a tunnel on the back. That is an indication that the fabric itself didn't have enough stiffness or stability to hold the tension of the bobbin thread. Okay, that's what gives that look on the back. The other thing is if you're trying to stitch around, let's say you're going to put a flower petal on a background and you're trying to stitch around the curve of the flower, if your fabrics are not stable, if they don't have stability, you're not going to be able to take your machine around a curve, a circle or a curve, without it pushing the fabric or stretching the fabric, and it'll create a pucker. So imagine if you ever tried to stitch around a circle and it looks really great until you get to the end where you're meeting your stitch and you get that little fold over pucker. That's an indication that the fabric wasn't properly stabilized. So in a way, what I'm doing is sort of as if I were to press a press-on leave-in stabilizer on the back of my my fabric. If you're familiar with machine embroidery, you know embroidery is all about the stabilizer. depending on the number of stitches you use, depends on the amount of stiffness. Sometimes you can use a tearaway, sometimes, so you get my point. It's all about stability. So for applique, if I want to have a quilt and when I lay under it, when it's done, it's nice and soft and it doesn't feel stiff or hard, I can still fold it. That's all the malleability of the fabric. So if I use a product like this and stitch it like I normally would, then when I use it afterwards, I wash it out. Now, when you're using this product, it makes the fabric stiff. It doesn't make it sticky. So in order to use a placement product, we'll use a water-soluble glue. So I'm using a water-soluble stabilizer and a water-soluble glue to do my applique. Now, what are the pros and cons of that? So the pros of, I've got them written down over here, that's why I keep looking down. So the pros of Terial Magic are that it is completely machine washable, and all of the water-soluble glues and water-soluble stiffeners we use will wash out when your quilt is washed. Also, it makes the fabric very stable, so it's very easy to sew. And those are my two favorite reasons for at least learning how to use this technique, because there are always going to be times in your sewing career where you're going to need to reach into your quilter's toolbox, as I like to say, and pick out some sort of technique that helps you with a particular item. So those are the two reasons I use it. It goes out, it's really easy to use, it's easy to use on quick pieces. The pros of using it for this project are those two things. The cons of using it for this project. You have to spray your backgrounds and you have to spray your foregrounds before you cut your petals in order to do this. So you would spray the fabrics, you're gonna have a cup of coffee, let the stuff soak in, then you're gonna press it. If you're in a class environment and there's only 2 irons, well, you're probably going to be backed up on the iron for a little bit, but we're used to that in our quilting. You have to stabilize the background and the foreground. There's no choice. If you try to take a stiffened petal and your petals are nice and stiff, but your background isn't stiff, the background's where all those bobbin stitches are going to be under the back, so that's also holding the stability, so you have to do that too. For the purposes of this giant quilt, my Scrap Petal Garden, it's easier if I just hold up the picture. For the purposes of this, when you make your improv background, you're going to piece, you may be using a whole piece of fabric, or you may piece the background like I did here. If you're doing a pieced background, your pieced background is really large. So if you've watched my first video, I talk about breaking your quilt up into quadrants. So if you decide to use the Terial Magic spray, you're going to want to break your quilt up into quadrants. And if you're working with a great big petal and you've got 4 quadrants of fabric, the challenge is that you start building your petal with glue and this product. You can only probably place 2 to 3 to 5 petals at a time on your background, and then you have to take them and stitch them down. Because the glue, water-soluble glue, the way that we're going to tack it, because we're not trying to glue it down like a kindergartner, the way we're going to tack it, as you're manipulating the fabric underneath your sewing machine to stitch all the way around your items, which you do have to do, lifting it and moving it and everything can pull those petals off. So you're not going to be able to glue down 65 petals on your giant background and then work with it. It's not going to work that way. You have to do it a little bit at a time. So your choices are, you can build your big background and try to attach 3 to 5 petals at a time and manipulate a great big background under the bed of the sewing machine, or you can build it into quadrants, and then as you get towards the edge of those quadrants where they connect together, you're going to pin back half of the petal, stitch them together, and then lay the petal back down and build it that way. So that's how we'll do the project there. So let's move on to the next option, which is Steam-A-Seam 2 or Easy Steam Light. Here are the 2 products. It's the same type of product. This is Steam-A-Seam 2. Pellon also makes a version of it. They're essentially the same product. What is it? It is, this is a fusible product. For those of you who've worked with fusibles know, there are its own challenges for working with fusibles. So here are the pros. The pros of using it is it's really kind of a cool product to use. It is a 2-sided Fusible. For those of you who are used to a Fusible, you fuse it onto the back of your fabric, you cut your shapes, you peel the paper, now you have this stuff with glue on the back, and you lay it down, you press it where you want it permanently, and then you stitch around it. That's how Fusibles work. This particular product is sticky. So you will press it down onto the fabric like you would normally do. When you peel the paper off the back, what you get is a sticky type background. It's like a color form if you're used to using those old color forms. Then you can take it and stick it to your background. If you don't like where you stuck it, you peel it off and you move it. And you can move those pieces all around until you get your petals where you want. So if you're using lots of different colors or fabrics, you can move them all over the place and then keep moving them until you get your placement exactly where you want it. Then you're going to want to press it down and get those permanently adhered before you take it over to your machine and sew around. Okay, now what are the pros of using this product? Well, ease of design placement is probably the biggest pro. It's the reason I like it, because it's kind of fun to move your petals all around to get your perfect placement. Sort of like doing those collage quilts by Laura Hine. You can put them all over the place until you're ready to stitch it down. That's a really, really good pro. Once those pieces are steamed in place, and yes, when you go to press them, you have to use steam in order to activate the glue to get it to go permanent. So we need steam irons, okay? But once it's in place, it is a permanent product. So what that means is I recommend that you still stitch around your petals, but that means when you take it over to the machine and you're fighting this big piece of fabric underneath the machine, they're not going to be coming unglued in theory, right? So it's a little bit easier to stitch under the throat of the machine with them. There isn't as much prep time. So if you do your background ahead of time and you show up to class, you can press that steam onto the back of your fabric, start cutting your petals. Your quilt will go together a little quicker than your friend who chose to use Terial Magic. And then you, of course, won't need any extra water-soluble glue because the items are sticky. They're not going to be moving around. So you'll put them where you want them. You'll take them over gently to the ironing board, press them down. So that's the ease of that. Those are the pros. What are the cons? That Fusible will remain in your quilt forever. It's not washable. It's going to stay there. If you've ever used Fusible before, it can make quilts very stiff. I try to use the light versions of the product as much as possible, but it's still very stiff. And sometimes the lighter versions don't glue as well as the thicker ones, so it will remain in your fabric forever. A con that you don't, well, in any type of time that you're going to use a Fusible, one of the cons is that it's glue. And when you put it near or on your iron, there's always going to be somebody in class that's never used a Fusible before, or who overheats and doesn't read the instructions, and their piece gets a little skewed, and then they wind up with stuff on their iron, which means I have to bring iron off with me to clean all the irons in class to keep them from being ruined. You could use a pressing sheet, but with this particular product, you have to use steam, so a pressing sheet really doesn't work. So using the Fusible itself is one of the cons. It can be a little challenging and a little tricky, and some people just really don't like it. I can teach you a few ways where you can be a little bit safe with it, but it's hard to use. It really is. And then one of the things I think no one thinks about is you have to press with steam. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal. If you always press with steam, it's probably not something you've thought about. I am not a steam presser. I'm a dry iron presser. I come from that camp. And the reason I come from that camp is when you put steam onto a quilt block, you're essentially moistening the fabrics and wetting them. When you wet a fabric, it can go out of skew. So one of the things people don't think about is, oh, I'm just going to lay my background, my perfectly cut, perfectly pieced, perfectly square background down, and I'm going to steam a bunch of stuff on top of it, and it's going to remain perfectly straight and perfectly square. And that's not always the case. Now, some people are very good at using it, and they can keep their background looking really great. I have seen some disaster projects when you go to press with steam, and people can't understand, why is my block, a 1/4 inch bigger in one direction and a ½ inch bigger in the other direction. And almost always, the first question out of my mouth is, do you press with steam? And almost always the answer is yes. So if you're constantly, just like you know, errors multiply, right, when you're sewing. So if you don't have a perfect 1/4 inch seam and you're sewing a block with 57 pieces in it, if you have a little tiny bit of an error, that error multiplies. And by the time you get to the outside of the block, depending on the number of pieces, can be a really large error. If you're pressing with a lot of steam and you're pressing your whole background that way, there can be some graduated error to the whole project. Now, in my opinion, if you put your whole background together and you show up with it as square as possible and you follow the instructions and you steam only what you need to do to get the piece down, you should be fine. And you can always trim the background square afterwards. You can always put a border on it and fix little things if you're a magician. But it's just something to think about in the cons. So there's always problems with both projects in class because, you know, I never know the level of skill of the person doing it. So some people who are beginners may find it easier to use Fusible than they do using Terial Magic. Here's the real kicker. Okay, I would say that you would choose your kit based on the method that you want to use in class that you think works for you. The real truth of the matter is you're going to learn both. So if you want to learn something new and try something new, then pick the one that's new to you. But if you feel like it's tried and true, you just want to get it done easy, you just want to get the project completed, which I fully respect and understand, pick the one that's easiest for you. And that's really the truth of it. You're going to learn a little bit about color and mixing. You're going to learn both of the two techniques. And the truth of the matter is they both work depending on what project you're working on. So I think if it were me, I've done the quilts both ways. And when I come to your guild to do this project with you, you'll see both quilts in both ways. You'll be able to touch both and feel both and see what I've done with both. If I had to make another one today, I would probably use the Steam-A-Seam because it's faster. However, when I'm doing applique and I'm working in small block sizes, I 98% of the time use the Terial Magic method because I know eventually, even if it's a sample for something, that is going to be my quilt. And eventually it's going to get washed. And I really don't like having a Fusible product stuck in my quilt. So that's the truth from me and the honesty from me about which one I would choose for which project. And I do have a nested petal class where I do it exclusively with Terial Magic because it's a block by block based project. And I think it's really important to learn both methods because you never know, like I said, when you want to use it, especially if you're working with a baby quilt. So you're putting applique. This is very popular to put appliques on little baby quilts, like a great big elephant or something. You can actually use this product and you can do it with like Mickey and flannel and things that are texturally really interesting and stiffen the fabric beforehand and then make your applique and then it washes out and you don't have all that stiffness and everything from Fusible. So I think it's an excellent alternative to using any type of Fusible in certain circumstances. So hopefully I've answered enough of your questions and you feel really confident about making the decision which product to use for class. And I'm really excited to see you at class, so I will see you later. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask because I'm always here to answer questions. All right? Oh, the one thing that I didn't tell you is how much Fusible you get. You get a 2-yard piece of the Fusible, which is actually pretty good. So that it works out equivalent to about the same amount of money. So either a 16-ounce bottle of Terial Magic or 2 yards of Fusible. And then I will have extra there if you find that you're running out and you need more Fusible. Okay? Thanks. Have a happy day and happy quilting.